Hey now, it's Delta City Fox here. It is Saturday, September 12th, 2020. Thank you for joining me as I walk here on Lakeshore Drive and next to Lake Michigan in the Edgewater neighborhood of Chicago, Illinois. On the agenda today is the question, what is the role of government? Why do we even have a government in the first place? What purpose does it serve? I'm an American citizen living in the United States. Accordingly, I will answer this question using the United States government, which is a democratic constitutional republic, as the archetype for government. I have found that most Americans have no idea how to answer this question. This includes career politicians and other government employees. That's unfortunate because the United States government is an extremely powerful entity and plays a very important role in many people's lives. Accordingly, people should understand what its purpose is. The role of government. The government has a de jure or legal role. It also has a de facto or actual role. First, government's de jure or legal role: to secure the realization of certain God-given unalienable rights for its constituency. Second, government's de facto or actual role: to be God. So, how do I figure that government's de facto role is to be God? Well, what unalienable rights government is supposed to ensure and how comprehensively those rights are supposed to be ensured is legally ambiguous. Accordingly, it's subject to an ever-expansive interpretation, as we take expressly stated negative rights and interpret implicitly stated positive rights. Add to that government is an entity with godlike powers, and it has an air of legitimacy. The inevitable result is that government will be worshipped as a deity, as the list of rights that it secures grows bigger and more comprehensive. So, those were the broad strokes, but now let's look at some of the fine print in identifying government's de jure role of securing unalienable rights, and how that is transformed into a de facto role of being God. To begin, let's examine this excerpt from the preamble of the U.S. Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. This excerpt communicates four very important things, which I'm going to address in illustrating government's de facto role as a deity. First, it states that God has granted us certain unalienable rights. Second, it states that government is acting as a proxy for God in order to guarantee the realization of these unalienable rights. Third, it implies that without government, these certain unalienable rights would not be realized. And fourth, it gives government an air of legitimacy. So, to the first point, that God granted us certain unalienable rights. What are these unalienable rights that God granted us that government is now securing for us? The Declaration of Independence says that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But what does that even mean? It's rather ambiguous. Moreover, how proactive versus hands-off should government be in securing life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? To wit, let's take your right to life. Should government merely defend your person from being infringed upon by instituting a governmental criminal justice system? Or perhaps government should be more proactive in securing your right to life by providing you with basic survival needs like food, water, and shelter. Or maybe government should be very proactive in securing your right to life by providing you with a personal bodyguard and with state-of-the-art healthcare from cradle to grave. So what life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness means is ambiguous, and thus open to a vast array of interpretations. Now let's explore the United States Constitution. The Preamble. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. So, to form a more perfect union along with justice, domestic tranquility, common defense, general welfare, and liberty. This list is less ambiguous than life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but it's still ambiguous. To wit, to form a more perfect union and to promote the general welfare. What do those even mean? They can mean anything. Now, the Bill of Rights. Here in the United States, the first 10 amendments to our government's Constitution is called the Bill of Rights. Among the multiple rights explicitly stated in the first 8 amendments are a right to free speech, a right to bear arms, a right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures, a right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury, a right to be free from cruel and unusual punishment. These rights are less ambiguous, but then you have a catch-all in the Ninth Amendment, which states that there are potentially more unnamed, unenumerated rights, thus leaving the door open for more ambiguity. And then there is the Necessary and Proper Clause, which authorizes government to legally do something if it's necessary and proper to carry out other recognized government functions. Moreover, the 10th Amendment purports to reserve rights unassigned to the federal government, per the Constitution, to the states. So just because the federal government isn't securing a right for you, it doesn't mean that a state or local government won't do so. So if you want government to do something, then there is a menu of legal authorities that you can appeal to. Now, rights explicitly mentioned in the Bill of Rights are for the most case interpreted as negative or passive rights. Your right to bear arms doesn't mean that government provides you with a rifle, nor does it mean that government stops non-government actors from restricting your ability to bear arms on their private property. This right to bear arms instead purports to restrict government from infringing on your right to have weapons. Likewise, your right to free speech doesn't mean that government purchases a 30-second Super Bowl commercial segment for you so that you can say your piece. Nor does it mean that you can go to your neighbor's lawn to exercise free speech. Rather, it purports to stop government from impeding your speech. So these are expressly stated negative rights. However, presently in the year 2021, the U.S. federal government, along with state and local governments, are ensuring or attempting to ensure more and more implied positive rights. Today, some of these commonly claimed rights are healthcare, education, housing and shelter, food and water, a living wage, child care services, sexual contraception, and freedom from discrimination from non-governmental actors. To exemplify this, let's take a look at this clip from a 2019 speech by United States Senator Bernie Sanders during his run in the 2020 United States presidential election.
Now, and what you've heard here, we have got to go forward and make sure that we guarantee economic rights to people, not just political rights. You know, when we talk about freedom, it is great that we have freedom of speech and freedom of religion, but what does freedom mean for somebody who is sleeping out on the streets? What does freedom mean if you're making $12 an hour and can't afford health care? So what we are trying to do in this campaign is kind of redefine what politics is about in America and what human freedom is about. So we believe that in America, healthcare is a human right. We believe that education is a human right. We believe that housing is a human right.
In the clip, Senator Sanders states that education, healthcare, and housing should be human rights in the United States. Now, none of these rights are explicitly enshrined in the U.S. Constitution, and Sanders has not suggested constitutional amendments to do so. That would be a very arduous task, and as 2021, a constitutional amendment hasn't happened since 1992. However, by parsing words with explicit rights and using other legal ambiguities, such as the Ninth Amendment and the necessary and proper clause, Sanders or any other lawmaker would have a much lower threshold to justify the U.S. federal government using its power to ensure these rights or any other unnamed rights as implicit, unenumerated rights. So we can see how government's role in people's lives is becoming more and more comprehensive, and while government isn't omnipresent, it's certainly moving in that direction, as the list of rights that it guarantees becomes larger and larger due to more expansive interpretations of what those rights are. Now to the second point that I noted earlier from the preamble of the U.S. Declaration of Independence, that government is acting as a proxy for God in order to guarantee the realization of our God-given unalienable rights. The text from the Declaration of Independence reads, "All men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men." So, how does government act as a proxy for God in order to secure these rights? Well, put simply, it has godlike powers, and it has godlike omniscience. Concerning its godlike powers, government claims a legal double standard over us by violating the non-aggression principle. The non-aggression principle, or the NAP, states that it is immoral to initiate the use of force or fraud against someone else's person or property. Government is a group or entity that claims a monopoly over the legal right and the supposed moral right to violate the NAP in a given geographical area. So, the U.S. federal government can legally initiate force or fraud against you or I if we are in its claimed territorial boundaries. This godlike power is not absolute, though, as it purports to be restricted by the Constitution. However, as we've discussed, the Constitution is subject to an ever-expansive and subjective interpretation. Concerning government's godlike omniscience, the U.S. federal government is a democracy. While voting doesn't give government all-knowing omniscience on its face, like that of an all-powerful deity, it does elicit, at least subconsciously, recognition by the governed of a lesser degree of omniscience, due to the group wisdom that is supposed to come from voting. So, the U.S. federal government is an entity that has the supposed just power and the supposed omniscience to use force to reorganize society in a meaningful way. Such traits mimic that of a deity. Moreover, while the U.S. Declaration of Independence expressly recognizes that government is acting as a proxy for God, God is mentioned nowhere in the U.S. Constitution. So, to the extent that our society is governed by the Constitution, without recognition of the Declaration of Independence, government acts like a deity but doesn't realize that it's doing so. Accordingly, it transforms from a proxy for God into a deity in its own right, as it goes from securing God-given unalienable rights per the Declaration of Independence to granting rights on its own, like an all-powerful deity, per an ever-expansive interpretation of the Constitution. Now to the third point from the preamble of the U.S. Declaration of Independence. The implication that only government can ensure the realization of certain God-given, unalienable rights. Proponents of government typically put forward two contentions in support of this argument. Firstly, that there are certain services necessary to ensuring unalienable rights, such as a police force, a court system, a prison system, regulation, and military defense, that there are no viable non-government business model alternatives for. Secondly, that there are services traditionally provided by government that do have viable non-government business model alternatives, such as the post office, but that government must still provide these services because such services are too vital to securing unalienable rights for them to be left up to the market discipline, market correction, and supposed unpredictable nature of the free market. Now, I don't believe that only through government can unalienable rights be secured. Accordingly, I disagree with the two previously stated contentions, but my illustrations for viable non-government business model alternatives for everything that government does, and my arguments against the necessity for government to otherwise secure unalienable rights will have to be explored in future videos. The fact is that most people do believe that only through government can unalienable rights be secured. Now to the fourth and final point from the preamble of the U.S. Declaration of Independence, that the U.S. government has an air of legitimacy. So if you have a powerful entity ruling over you, like the government, when are you going to accept it, and when are you going to rebel against it? If it has an air of legitimacy, then you are going to be much more inclined to accept its governance of you. So, what are a few ways in which the U.S. government communicates such an air of legitimacy? Let's take a look at the Declaration of Independence excerpt from earlier. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. The excerpt begins with, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." Emphasis on we. So, does we only include the 39 signers of the Declaration of Independence? Or does it purport to include others? And if so, who and why? The excerpt ends with, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Did the 39 signers of the Declaration of Independence really derive consent from all those who the U.S. government governed over in 1776? And does that consent legitimately include you and I ex post facto over 200 years later in 2021? Likewise, the excerpt from the preamble of the Constitution that we considered earlier opens with, "We the people." Note that the Constitution had 56 signers and was endorsed in 1787. So who does "we the people" legitimately include? These government statements imply that government is sanctioned by those people who it rules over. This purports to make its violation of the non-aggression principle over you and I legitimate, and not a violation at all, because it is supposedly consensual, like some sort of dominatrix submissive relationship. Though BDSM has a safe word, how do you, on the other hand, opt out of government? Moreover, the fact that the de jure purpose of government is to secure the realization of unalienable rights for the people presents government as a force for good. This makes us as the governed less likely to reject its governance over us and more likely to embrace ex post facto its claimed air of legitimacy. Now, to the extent that this air of legitimacy is actual versus a smokescreen is something that will have to be explored in future episodes. The fact is that most people recognize the US federal government's air of legitimacy. So, when summing this all up, this Kurt Vonnegut quote from his 1962 book Mother Night comes to mind. "We are what we pretend to be, so we must be careful what we pretend to be. The US federal government pretended to be God, and eventually that's what it became. Per the Declaration of Independence, government's de jure role is to secure the realization of God-given, unalienable rights for its constituency. In accomplishing this goal, the US federal government took on the following godlike characteristics. It can legally initiate force or fraud against us to organize society. It's the guardian of our God-given unalienable rights and the arbiter of what those rights are. It can grant us additional rights if it so chooses by adopting a broader reading of the Constitution. It has a lesser form of omniscience through the group wisdom of democratic voting. It purportedly is the only thing standing between us and chaos, in that it provides services that it claims there are no viable, non-government business model alternatives for, such as the police, courts, prisons, regulation, and military defense. And its exercising all of these godlike powers is presented as perfectly moral, in that it tells us ex post facto, per the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, that we the people sanctioned government in the first place. So, government, by taking on these godlike characteristics to accomplish its legal de jure role of securing God-given unalienable rights, became what it was imitating and assumed its actual role in our society, that of a de facto deity. So, using the US federal government as the archetype, my conclusion is that the role of government is to be God. That's my take. Do you agree or disagree? And if you disagree, then what is the role of government? I appreciate that you've taken the time to consider this thought-provoking question. I hope that you have an excellent remainder of your day, and I will see you in the next video. Goodbye now.